Let me get all settled in before we start recording here. Okay. There we go. Okay, cool. I'm ready whenever you are. Okay, hi, welcome everybody. My name is Colleen Williams and I'm with the Texas Sibling Network, and I'm here tonight to talk about future planning. So I'm just going to start off with a brief introduction about what the Texas Sibling Network is, what we do, and then we're going to kind of jump right into future planning. I think as a sister to someone with a disability, I do think that future planning is one of the most important. I think it's highly important. I can't even stress how important it is. So I'm super excited to be partnering with Inclusion is Sweet to do this webinar tonight. So just a little bit about me. My name is Colleen, like I said earlier. I am the project lead for the Texas Sibling Network. This is my youngest brother, Steven. I'm one of 5 kids, and we grew up as a very close-knit type family. 2 of my brothers are actually adopted, so I kind of came into the sibling identity a little bit different than some people might. But we're all very close and tight-knit and have all grown up together. My family grew up in San Antonio, but they currently live in Lubbock, which has been an interesting transition with services and stuff being pretty different up in West Texas versus San Antonio. And I have my master's in social work from the University of Texas, and so I work with the Texas Sibling Network as well as another human services agency here in Austin. So what is the Texas Sibling Network that I keep talking about? The Texas Sibling Network is for adult siblings by adult siblings. We know from research and from anecdotal experiences that sibling relationship is the longest lasting relationship in someone's life. It's who they know. It's typically who you know from birth to death. And a lot of times we know that a lot of times siblings end up playing a pretty important role in their sibling with a disability's life. We know that a lot of times they end up coming into caregiving roles at both a young age and then older in a more official capacity. We also know that that relationship can have some strains in it as well. And so the TSN is here to kind of support siblings throughout that lifespan of that sibling relationship and whatever it looks like and whatever walk of life people are in, and where they are with that. So we have different city chapters all around the city. Right now, most of our programming is virtual and will be virtual indefinitely moving forward until we, until COVID ends. I don't really know what we're supposed to say anymore, but we'll be virtual for the time being. So one of the things we hear a lot from siblings is about the need for future planning. We hear from a lot of siblings. Sometimes we hear from siblings who have kind of been thrust into it, like all of a sudden one of their parents has a health emergency and there's really no future plan for their sibling with a disability. Sometimes that's a lot of times we get siblings in crisis. And so one of my big things that I talk a lot about to siblings is just about how important it is to be having these conversations starting young. I once heard a professional say that we should start planning for an individual's future as soon as they turn 3 years old, which sounds really, really young, but I can see what the logic is behind that. We never know what's going to happen. And that's why future planning is so important. I have one of my brother's friends up in Lubbock. She is like, whenever I think of why future planning is important, I always think of his friend. And his friend A is a super loving, super great individual. She loves my brother Steven. It's like she's like, Steven's my best friend. She loves Steven. But her mom had been sick, and a couple different times my parents had kind of asked her, well, what's the plan in case something happens? And she was always like, my plan is that I'm gonna get healthy. I'm gonna beat this cancer. And she had a very sudden decline and ended up passing away, and there was no future plan for her daughter, who was 30 years old, and all of a sudden there was no plan. And my family's been trying to help out and help them get into a better spot, but there's no siblings, there's no family members who can help out. It's all kind of fallen on this local organization. And so when I think of why future planning and why it's personally important to me, I always think of my brother's friend A, and I think of all these other individuals that I know, and I know how important planning for the future is and how important it is to have these conversations as a family, as an individual with a disability. All of these, I think it's really important for us to be having these conversations often, to be revisiting them often, And definitely just making sure that this is a priority, not something that we're like, well, whenever mom and dad get sick, then we're going to do it. Like, no, we need to do it now. But before I kind of move on to some of the more, I guess, like nitty gritty of future planning, I do want to acknowledge that a big aspect of future planning is an emotional aspect. And I want to acknowledge it and also normalize it, that this is a tough conversation to have. When we're talking about future planning, there's a lot of emotions tied up in it. There's a lot of family dynamics that may not have been resolved, that are kind of caught up in it. And so it can be a very complicated subject, and not just because of lack of resources for adults with disabilities. It can be a complicated topic just because of the emotions that we know are involved with future planning. So kind of a lot of these emotional aspects that I hear from doing workshops and other stuff with families is, no one can take care of my child or loved one like I can. There's a lot of fear of mortality, fear of the unknown. What does the future look like? A lot of different family dynamics that come into play, and a lot of people who kind of just don't even know where to start, like that fear of just taking that first step. And so I do want to kind of, like I said, acknowledge that, and also acknowledge that this is something that sometimes we need to bring professionals in on. Maybe sometimes this is something that like we need to have some family counseling before we can even get started. We definitely need to think about these emotions. It can be hard. Like I know when I bring up this topic with my parents, a lot of times it can bring up a lot of emotions behind like, well, you know, they don't want to talk about, no one wants to talk about their eventual death or their eventual, you know, cognitive decline or whatever that may be. I think it's important for us to acknowledge the emotional aspects, but also figure out how we can work through them as a family, as a unit, and definitely get some of that planning in place. So just some kind of tips behind like how to work on that, like that mental emotional block. Definitely setting aside specific time to talk about it and to plan. That gives people time to like emotionally prepare for it. You don't want to just like spring this on your family after everyone's stuff and Thanksgiving dinner. You want to really think through like, when's a good time? When's everyone going to be in a calm, like not emotional state? So probably not like a weekday. Probably wouldn't be the best. I personally think for a lot of families, that the best time is probably going to be like on a weekend. Maybe like you plan a family dinner, and then at the end of it, while everyone's, you know, drinking their coffee and eating cake, we talk about future planning. I think it's important to name that time and to set it aside and to let everyone know in advance, so that way the topic's not just thrown out at people. And of course, you can always think, I know I'm saying family, but we can think outside of the family. Who are some important people in the individual's life that can be invited to the table? And of course, we always want to make sure that the person we're planning for is at the table as well. We never want to exclude a family member with a disability. We want to make sure that they're at the table. We want to make sure that they're able to come and to get the information. Another tip is just kind of breaking it down to smaller chunks. Future planning is a marathon, not a sprint. So we're not going to in one night have this beautiful, perfect future planning plan. It doesn't work that way. We're going to need to break it down into smaller chunks and kind of work through it that way. Once again, it's always important to bring, like I said, our loved one with a disability to the table, making sure that we're thinking about what's important to them as well as what's important for them. So when we talk about important to versus important for, so what would be important for my brother is that he live in a house that is wheelchair accessible and that has like wide sidewalks out front so he can go on walks. But what's important for my brother is that my brother really likes coffee. So he would like to live someday in the future in a place that's close by coffee. So that's kind of when we're thinking about, a lot of times in the disability world, we're very good about thinking about what's important for people, right? We do all this planning of like, well, they need XYZ, they need this support, they need this resource. But really, we also want to bring their voice to the table and see what do they want, what's important for our loved one with a disability, what do they want in their future. Just kind of being future minded, I think that just kind of is like a mindset of like always thinking towards like even when our kids are younger and in schools with an IEP, like okay, so like one of my brother's IEP goals was to like bang a stick. And it's like, okay, well, banging a stick, like what is that going to do for his future? Like, is that going to be a vocational skill someday? So I think even from a young age, making sure that what we're doing is future minded, and not just having a goal for the sake of having a goal. Also, something I'll talk about kind of throughout this presentation is building a letter of intent. So letter of intent is a roadmap. I always say, if the individual with a disability were to die tomorrow, somebody, or not to die, the parents of whoever's a caregiver were to die tomorrow, we should be able to come in, get that letter of intent, and be able to, someone should be able to come in and use it as a roadmap to ensure that they have the best life possible that they want. I'll talk a little more about that. Another thing I think that we can help us is just kind of visualize what's the dream for our loved one with a disability, and also what's the nightmare. It's okay to acknowledge that we have a nightmare for what someone's like, I have a nightmare for what my brother's life could look like. But I also have a dream for what his life could look like. And I think it's important to acknowledge both and to hold both at the same time and be able to give weight to both of them and to acknowledge that, yes, we may have these nightmares of like, I have a nightmare of my brother like living in a group home and like me going to check on him and him like having a seizure and no one noticed. Like, that's my nightmare. But my dream is my brother living with a group of like-minded people who are able to support him. He's able to go to the library and go get coffee together and hang out and have a job and have a lot of dignity and worth. So we can acknowledge both and admit that they're both here. That's some other questions. So this is just like a really quick future planning checklist. I do much longer, like 3-hour future planning workshops in person. And so this is something I usually hand out to people. This isn't an exhaustive list, but this is a good list to kind of, and I have, if you email me, I'll email you a paper copy of this. But this just kind of gives us, you can kind of look at it and look through and be like, what have we done? And where do we need to, look at moving forward? Just kind of establishing respite, vocational services, residential placements. And we know from a lot of research that about 70, we know from research of Texas Siblings that we just did, the Texas Sibling Network did, we know that 70% of people with disabilities in Texas are still living in their parents' home. And although that's fine, I mean, living with your parent, if that's what they want, if that's what an individual wants, that's fine. But we also know that that isn't always the most stable placement, because we know that parents get older, we know that parents get sick, they have health crises. And so we really want to kind of look at like, what does stability look like, and how do we keep that placement? And what could it look like for a loved one with a disability to live on their own in some type of supportive living, or even on their own with a group of roommates, or whatever that may look like, depending on what is, important to and important for them and just feasible. Okay. So usually in my future planning workshops, I hand out a piece of paper and we do this circle of support activity together. So if you have a sheet of paper, feel free to grab one and kind of jot down what you think of when I talk about this. But if you don't have one, just kind of do it in your head. So an important tool that I like to use when we're talking about future planning is the circle of support. So if we had more time, I would have everybody do it for themselves, like personally. But because I do think self-care and support for ourselves and our own networks is important. But for right now, I want us to focus on whoever you showed up here today when I said future planning, who are you thinking about? Whoever that may be, yourself, your sibling, your child, a cousin, whatever that looks like for you, your friend, whomever. So in that innermost circle, that white circle, we want to write down whoever you're future planning for, who are the people who are the closest to them. So I kind of call those like your ride or dies, the people that you would call when you have something great happen to you, and the people that you call when you have something not so great happen to you. Just kind of those super close people. That can be family or friends or whoever that looks like. Okay, and then in that yellow circle, so like the second circle, I want you guys just to kind of think about maybe people like other friends or family who support whomever you're future planning for, but aren't like their super close friends, super close people. So those might be like acquaintances, but not really, but those are more like people who like you might chat with a couple of times a month, but they're definitely not in that like that tight knit circle. They're kind of floating around, maybe relatives you see at family events, but don't really see outside of big family events. And then in that orange circle, that third circle, we're gonna list the people that go to the same school, the same workshop, clubs, just kind of those like acquaintances, people who they maybe like, you know, say hi to, they know of, they're acquaintances, but they're not, they won't be privy to a lot of like more personal information. People they work with. And then in that fourth circle, just the people that are paid to be in your loved one's life. So that might look like caregivers, therapists, teachers, doctors, hairdressers, whatever that looks like. And then I guess you guys can, I think you can unmute your guys' self if you would like, but or put it into the chat function. But like doing that, did anybody notice anything, any patterns that they want to share? I know one thing that when I do this activity, I hear a couple of different things typically. So one thing that we definitely hear a lot is that there are that kind of that fourth, that larger circle, that one on the outside, that one tends to be one of the, has the most amount of people. So a lot of times we find that people with disabilities have a lot of people paid to be in their lives. A lot of therapists, a lot of caregivers, a lot of different people who are paid to be in their lives. And we know that paid support can be really great resources. I still keep in contact with some, you know, people I've caregived for. My brother has had some great caregivers and therapists who have really been a great support to my family. But the one thing that we know about paid relationships is we know that paid relationships don't typically have the same amount of depth as those relationships we might find in the orange, yellow, or white circle. Because we know that that people that are paid can kind of be more transient, they're in and out of people's lives. So it's not as deep of a connection because there's always that exchange of money and resources. Another thing people sometimes note is that when they do this for themselves and also when they do it for their the person that they're future planning for, they notice that there's a lot of overlap in the circle. So maybe a lot of the mom's friends are also the child's friends. Which once again isn't inherently something that's wrong, but we do know that sometimes maybe once if mom has a health crisis and is pulling on her own innermost circle, that's going to not leave as many resources for the individual because they won't have as many independent relationships outside of like their family or their nuclear family. And so when we're talking about future planning, did I put this on the next slide? No. So when we're talking about future planning, building out this circle of support, it can be an important part of future planning, because within that circle of support, we find a lot of resources. Like, for example, we might find, for example, I know a family who they kind of did a similar activity, and they found that one of their family friends was opening up a small business and needed some help with some like stuff around, like opening like a bakery or something. So they needed some help like around the bakery sweeping, and kind of some help with the register, and kind of some more part-time work. And so the family was able to kind of utilize that like circle of support and be able to find a job for their son, and he was able to work in the bakery, and he used like natural support. Like the family friends had known him since he was young, and so they were able to provide some natural support. So instead of hiring a job coach to help him out at the job, they used the support that was already there. They used the family friends, and he became well known in the community, and that kind of broadened his own circle of support. He had his own relationships independent of his parents, and that helped broaden his circle of support. It just kind of gave him more relationships that were more in depth, because this kind of building of relationships is very important as we move forward to thinking about the future, especially when we think about individuals who may not have very strong family support, such as the young adult that I shared about earlier, my brother's friend whose mom passed away. She doesn't have a lot of family relationships, but she does have a very strong relationship at a day hab that she's been going to, and the day hab has really stepped in and has helped facilitate keeping her in Lubbock, and helping find providers to stay with her overnight, and kind of doing like a live-in host family situation for her that's enabled her to stay in her community of support. So this circle of support is pretty important, and we also want to always be thinking about how can we make it wider, that includes more people who aren't being paid in our loved one's life, and how can we also make the relationships that are there, how do we deepen them and make them even more, make them stronger in order to help when we think about future planning. So the next couple of slides, I'm just going to kind of touch on some different aspects of future planning. When I do this workshop in person, there's kind of like, to me, there's like a couple of major different elements of future planning that we really want to kind of talk about when we're thinking about building out this letter of intent for our loved one with a disability. We're really thinking about building out their future planning roadmap. These are going to be some of the important areas that we want to focus on, and that we want to see what are we doing when we're planning with them, and what resources, and what needs help, and what do we need to look at. So kind of one of the more important ones is housing. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of people with disabilities in Texas, about 70%, live with their parents in home. And although, like I said, this isn't necessarily a bad thing, we do also acknowledge that a lot of times parents can get burnt out. Caregiving can take an emotional and a physical toll on people. And so it's also not it's not always the most stable situation. When we're thinking long-term, like I mentioned, parents get old, parents get sick, and sometimes these events happen very fast and we don't have a lot of time. We also want to make sure, like when we're thinking about an individual who's living in the home with their parents, we also want to think about what does it look like? Like, do they own the home? Are there like any mortgages? Like financially, what's the stability of that house situation? There's also group homes. So group homes are kind of like congregate care settings for individuals with disabilities. There's typically like a couple different setups. There's one, a group home where they might live like in a neighborhood, and there would be anywhere between usually about 2 to 5 individuals who live in that home. It's in a neighborhood. It's run by staff and by a company who manage that home, and so there's different caregivers that come in and out, and different individuals who live in the home. And typically there should be some type of schedule, there should be routine and stuff built in. Not all group homes are created equally. I will tell you guys that. Some are, I've been in some super awesome group homes that are phenomenal and they're run great, and the individuals are really connected with the community and they're connected with their neighborhood and they have phenomenal staff. That's not every group home that I've been into. Some of them, the staff, there can be really high turnover in the staff because pay is really low. Which makes it just challenging to attract and keep good staff. There can be some different challenges with individuals in the home not always getting along, because you don't always get to, in a group home setting, you're not always like, it's not always like goodness of fit for the different individuals living there, like as a cohesive group. It really just depends. If you're thinking of looking at group homes, I just highly encourage people to really be able to go in and ask those really tough questions. We want to, you can Google just like questions to ask and when you're touring a group home, and just kind of really ask those tough questions and make sure it's going to be a good fit. And a lot of times we want to try to see like, oh, can we do like one overnight first and kind of see like what kind of fit it is, kind of like slowly ease into it. We know from a lot of research and also anecdotal stories that people with disabilities do better when we're like easing, when they're able to like most of us, like we want a transition time. We just don't want one day to live in our parents' home and the next day to live in a group home. Like that's not a good transition. That's not smooth. So if we are thinking about a group home, I encourage people to kind of think about it before the crisis happens. So the best time to transition into a group home is or any type of out of home setting is going to be when there's no crisis going on. It's when everything is calm. So we're able to maybe go for like an hour visit and then go spend the evening and then maybe spend an overnight and kind of move in slowly instead of it being like overnight, like my mom has a stroke and nobody can take care of me. I need to go live in this congregate care facility. There's also like intermediate care facilities, which are going to have like typically around like 8 to 12 people living in them, and they're going to be a little bit more, they're going to be less residential and more institutional. You're going to have it's going to be more people, so it's just going to be like more staff in and out. It's not going to always have the same homey kind of feel. I always recommend, if we're thinking about this kind of care, is just to ask around, because the best resources are other parents or other family members, and the people living in the home. Like, feel free to go in and ask, like I said, ask those hard questions when we're thinking about group homes and intermediate care facilities. Another option here in Texas is something called companion care. It's also sometimes referred to as adult foster care. And so it's when an individual would go and live in another family's home, and the family would be like their host family, and they would be very, integrated into the family unit. And there's some different funding sources for that. HSC is one of the main HSC. It's going to be one of the main, they can fund that. You also sometimes can get this funded if you have an adult child with a disability. Parents can get funding to become an HSC home, and then the parents can get paid to take care of their child. It's minimum wage, it's not great, but if it's something you're already doing, it definitely is a good option to explore, just kind of depending on the family and what works best for them. Some more options are just living alone or living with roommates. There's a family here in Austin, and they have, they're both UT professors. There's two families, and they each have sons with autism. And so they actually rented a house down in Hyde Park, which is right by UT. And they actually, they have it set up to where they have like roommates for their sons, adult sons with disabilities. And so the roommates like live in the house for a reduced rent, and they also can get paid through their provider hours to like help them out. I think they help out in like the morning and the evening. And so it gives their sons with autism like some independence, but also gives them some structure and supervision. And they're able to live down by UT, so they have access to like a lot of the different, going on at UT, and they work jobs in the community. And so I know for them, that's been like a really great setup. I think a lot of times when we talk about housing, we have to kind of start getting creative, especially here in Texas. There's just not a ton of great options. You know, we think 50 years ago, people with disabilities were pretty much automatically institutionalized, and so now that we've had a big push for community care, because we know that the community care is best, a lot of times our housing stuff is kind of lagging behind. So we have to get really creative. I've heard of I know of a sibling in Dallas, and they actually built onto their house, and so they have a little like mother-in-law suite, and their brother lives back there, and so he's able to like come eat dinner with their family, but he also has his own space, and everyone kind of has their own space, and he's allowed some independence. So we have a lot of families kind of getting really creative when it comes to housing, which I think is awesome. There's also like nursing homes, kind of goes back to the group home and some of the different challenges that we face there. There's some different nonprofits. Mara Bridge here in Austin is a good nonprofit. And there's, Natalie said Southland Fields in San Antonio has a really cool tiny house village that does something very similar. So like encourage people to kind of like just whatever you just kind of Google and just kind of see what pops up and what's around. There's some down in Houston as well. I'm blanking on the names. But yeah, also this is a great avenue for anyone who wants to direct some of their energy towards housing for people with disabilities. A great new field that we're kind of marching into. Texas Parent to Parent does a lot of really great work on creative housing options, and I highly encourage you guys to check out their website. We also TSN did a Facebook Live with Rosemary Alexander from Texas Parent to Parent, and she talks about creative housing options and how she actually worked on that with her own son, and she gives some like super phenomenal just tips. I wish I could show her video, but I don't have time. She's phenomenal, so yeah, really recommend. The name of the company, so there's a couple, there's Southwind Fields, there's also Mara Bridge here in Austin is another option. Problem with a lot of nonprofits is they're going to be private pay, and they're not going to always take the state funding, but a lot of times you can get state funding, and I know a lot of people have some people will kind of band together as a family with maybe like another family who has a child who has very similar needs, and they're able to kind of band together and kind of share overnight caregivers and either through class or MDCP or HSC, one of those funding sources, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a bit. You can kind of band together and like rent a house and use like SSI payments to pay for the rent, and then kind of get around the clock staff that way. But there's challenges with staff, and yeah, I wish there was like a perfect solution, but there's really not. So kind of the next kind of aspect of future planning I want to touch on is education and employment. We know that after the age of 21, school services stop. There's kind of this service level like drop off after the age of 21. A lot of services are provided to younger children, age 0 to 21. After 21, I don't know, I guess people stop needing services. We know that's not true, but that's kind of the adult services in Texas and the US in general kind of lag behind. We talk about education and employment. We always and once again, I'm going to refer back to that circle of support. We know that there's a lot of dignity and worth that comes with a job. Inclusion is Sweet really kind of harps on this, and of course you can check out their resources on it. But we know that most of us, we find some type of joy and dignity from our job. Most of us have a passion that we kind of pursue in our job. And so we think it's super important that our loved ones with disabilities have the same option. And it's not always going to look the same, and we never, I know my brother would never, I know sometimes we try to put people into little squares of well, we can teach people with disabilities how to bag groceries at the grocery store. And that's great if that's their passion, but that's not going to be everyone's passion. And so we want to we really want to play to what that individual's strengths is and what they want. As far as like higher education goes, we are seeing, colleges are kind of like getting with the fact that like, oh, people with disabilities can go to college. It's a revolutionary idea that we're kind of just now hitting on. There's a couple of different programs. University of Texas has something called E4, where the students go, they go and live at a dorm at UT, and they're able to kind of, and they're training on to be personal care assistants. And so they're able to live in the dorms and kind of get that like college experience, and also get some like job and vocational training. There's another one at A&M that's similar. There's a couple, there's another one, there's one up in West Texas actually. So these are all great options to look into. Community colleges, of course, even if it's just like auditing a class, to try to, find out like, just kind of taking a class in a couple of different subjects, figuring out what you're passionate about, figuring out what you're good at. That's what most of us, that's what most of us do. We turn 18, and when I was 18, I was going to be a nurse, and it turns out like I faint every time I see blood. So what worked for me was a social worker, because I just get to talk all day long. So we really want to, once again, play into those strengths and bring our individual to the table that we're talking about. This photo right here is actually an example. I have a sibling that I know in Dallas, and she's Indian, and she and her husband and her brother have all immigrated over from India. And so kind of culturally, like, her parents like have retired now, and it's like it's her turn to take care of her parents, but she has a brother with Down syndrome. And so they moved to the States a couple of years back, but she's had problems getting her brother services because he's not technically a US citizen. I think he's, I don't know, he's on some visa. And so they can't like access a lot of services. But one thing her brother loved to do is he made scarves. And so they kind of have worked on him and kind of taught him like, how to like make the scarves look like even more, more professional and stuff. And so he like makes scarves and he sells them at the farmer's market. So it's one way that he has that dignity and worth, and he's like building up his savings account because he wants to build a room onto his sister's house so he can just live there forever. And so that's definitely like one example of like of just kind of, once again, like looking to our strengths and building on it and looking what's within that circle of support who already exists there, and just kind of getting creative. Once again, we're gonna have, like, my family owns a winery, so my brother's future job is like putting the labels on the bottle. They got like an adaptive like label maker, so he can just like label the wine bottles. So that was something when my parents were talking about the winery, and like they've been growing grapes up in West Texas for years now. But when they were talking about like getting into the winery, that was like the first thing I said was like, that's fine, you guys can open a winery, but make sure you have a job for Steven. Like, figure out how we can build this in so he has a job. So he has a job of putting on the labels. So then kind of the next area I want to pivot to and talk about is guardianship options. So when an individual with disabilities turns 18, we really need to be talking about this before they turn 18, but like 18's cutoff age that we have to do this. We really think about like, as far as like guardianship goes. So back in the past, our automatic assumption has always been individuals with disabilities just automatically need guardianship. We now know, after listening to self-advocates, that this isn't true. Not everybody needs guardianship. And so guardianship can be a very, it works, I always have to tread lightly here. It works for some people, it can be, but a lot of times we know that a lot of times we can start a loved one with a disability at a lower level, and then kind of see whether or not they need that full guardianship. Most people don't need full guardianship. That's my professional opinion. Most people can get by with power of attorney or medical power of attorney, because both of those can help an individual, if they're incapacitated in some way, make decisions. Guardianship just really takes away that option for them, just really takes away that autonomy that we really want to protect as much as possible, because I mean, all of us like to make our own decisions, and we don't want to be told what to do. And I think that rings true for whoever we're doing future planning for. Representative payee, that can be something if an individual struggles with like making payments. It's just pretty much where like your paycheck is essentially like garnished, and then it allows, or your social security, whatever income you have. So an individual like is able, like that an individual kind of controls that money, and so every month they may like pay rent for the individual, and then they kind of give like an allowance situation. Supported decision-making agreements is kind of what the disability community is really pushing for, and we're hearing from a lot of self-advocates that it's important. Once again, Disability Rights Texas is kind of the big pusher of this, and so Texas was actually the first state to, Texas was the first state to have a supported decision-making agreement in law. And so with supported decision-making, it gives an individual with a disability the option to decide what they need help in and who can help them with it. And so, for example, maybe an individual decides that they need help with money, that they, are not able to, that they're not able to, maybe they have problems with like making rent and being able to manage their money. And so they would appoint an individual who would be able to help them, out with like paying rent every month and helping them balance their budget and stuff like that. And the great thing about supported decision making is it doesn't have to be one person. When we're looking at power of attorney, medical power of attorney, it's going to be one person. Supported decision making allows an individual with a disability to say like, hey, I have a brother who's an accountant. I bet he would be really great at helping me out with money. Or I have a sister who knows a lot about medicine and stays really cool in emergency situations. I would like her to help me out with my medical decisions. And you don't have to go to court for it. Guardianship, you have to go to court and the individual has to be served. It's a pretty like invasive process. And so whereas some of these other ones, power of attorney, medical power of attorney, representative payee, it's for decision making, are gonna they're not gonna have to get the courts involved. An individual still retains their right to be their own guardian. So I would recommend like looking more into them, looking at some of the resources at Disability Rights Texas, and just kind of seeing what works best for the individual with a disability. But there's a whole bunch of studies on there's like a school to guardianship pipeline, where we just kind of like push families towards guardianship. And we really want to kind of get away from that and kind of look at what the individual needs, as opposed to just saying like, well, all people with disabilities need guardianship. That's not true. So I've obviously talked a lot about, but I've talked a lot about finances. I have a lot of different things that do involve finances, and I haven't specifically addressed finances. Finances, when we're talking about future planning, it kind of is what is able to fund. I mean, we can have these really big drains, but like, how do we pay for it? That's like one of the number one questions I get when I do this workshop. And so one of the most important things that I encourage people to do is to ensure that they're on the Texas Medicaid waiver programs. There's a wait list of like, it depends on the program, but there's really long wait lists. Texas has like some of the worst wait lists in the country. So if you're a loved one, or if you're not on a wait list, the first thing I want you to do tonight is to Google Texas Medicaid waiver programs and figure out how to get yourself onto them. And if you ever meet anyone who has younger children with disabilities, ask them if they're on this. I gave a presentation up in Lubbock back in the early winter about this, and I met someone and their daughter was 17 and they had never heard of waiver programs. And they were like, well, and I was explaining it to them, and they were like, well, how long is it going to take? And I'm like, I mean, you've got 15 at this point, you probably have around 15 years to wait for funding. So waiver programs, get on them. There's a couple different ones. There's MDCP, Medically Dependent Children's Program. That's for children ages 0 to 21 who are medically fragile. The most important one, I think, when we're talking about adult future planning is something called CLASS, and that pays for, it's like the Mercedes-Benz of the Medicaid waiver programs. Like it pays for a lot of different things. It pays for day programs, it pays for caregivers, it pays for, you can pay for like durable medical equipment. It's important. It helps out with, I believe it might even include home modification, but don't quote me on that one. And there's also some like county-based funding that also comes along with these. So if you're not on these wait lists, get on them. Just Google it, and if you need help finding it, I'll have my email at the end. Email me and I'll help you walk through it. So that's a major source of funding, because when we're talking about like housing, a lot of times like we're talking about an individual having an attendant who comes in and helps them in some type of like independent care setting. Like it's going to typically be paid for by these waiver programs. SSI, Social Security income, also important. An individual can apply to receive that once they turn 18. Highly encourage that people do apply for that. I know sometimes I hear from people like, oh, well, you know, blah, blah, blah. If I'm working, my like SSI payment's going to go down. And that's not true. There's an incentive to work program. As long as you're not working, I think it's more than 20 hours, you still keep your SSI. I know what some people do is they start getting SSI when their family member turns 18, and they're able to kind of put some of that money aside every month, and then kind of have, whenever they hit the point where they're kind of able to move out, have that money set aside. Medicaid, health insurance, it's important. You're on SSI, you can qualify for it. I would just, once again, if you're not sure whether or not your individual with a loved one has it, make sure to Google it and just make sure you call the phone number and work on getting that. Some individuals may qualify for food stamps and Section 8 housing. Once again, encourage you to reach out, see what those benefits are, take full advantage of all of the state and federal benefits that exist. Texas Workforce Commission can also help out with vocational training and job training. It's kind of a hit or miss in my experience on how good they are, but sometimes you look in and you get like a really great vocational rehab counselor who can really help out with job placement and job searchers. But once again, a lot of these benefits have waiting lists, and so it's best to be on the list, even if you're not sure whether or not you're going to need them. I always encourage parents just to kind of go ahead and get on the list. You can always turn it down if you don't want it for whatever reason. But go ahead, and people are like, oh, I'm not sure if my child's going to qualify. And it's like, just go ahead and see. Like, it's just so, I think it's just so important for people to really make sure that, especially with how long the wait lists are, just to make sure that and they're not technically wait lists, they're interest lists. I got corrected by someone who worked at Medicaid the other day. But they're wait lists. Another thing that comes up a lot when we're talking about finances is like, what is like special needs trust or like ABLE accounts, like where do we keep the money? So there's kind of two main options when we're thinking about that. So an ABLE account is a relatively new thing. So pretty much ABLE accounts allow for individuals, it's like a savings account for people with disabilities where they don't get docked if they have more than $2,000 or $3,000 in savings. If you have more than $2,000 or $3,000 in savings as an individual with a disability, you start losing your benefits. And that's just ridiculous because it keeps people impoverished and keeps them from being able to amass wealth. It's ridiculous. So that is where ABLE accounts come in. Pretty much it's an account, it's pretty much a savings account. And you can actually get like a debit card that you can use from it. And you can put up to $15,000 in there per year. And as long as your able account stays under $100,000, you don't, like your SSI, your Medicaid, none of it's affected. You don't need any type of trustee to administer this account. Once again, it's pretty much, it's a savings account, and you can use it and you can access it. And you can use it for pretty much, there's like not as many limitations on it that we sometimes see special needs trusts have a bit more limitations on it. But yeah, so this might be good. Like I know for my brother, our plan is to, when he turns 18, we're gonna apply for SSI for him. And he'll still be living with my parents and going to high school, because he'll go to high school through 21. But our plan is to start getting Social Security checks and like putting them away for him in his able account, so that way he has access to that money. You can also, like my brother could potentially like pay rent to my parents out of his SSI checks. And also, like if he's getting paid for working at the winery, he can put that aside into his money and it won't impact his benefits. This is especially important if your loved one is gonna have anybody who like leaves some money. If you're lucky enough to be in a family where you're going to get money when somebody passes away, a relative, a grandparent, a family friend, etc., we're going to want, if that money goes directly to the individual with a disability, they have the potential to lose their, they have the potential to lose their funding, to lose their SSI. And like once you lose that, it's just a pain. So like we want to, when we're thinking about future planning, this is also important so people don't lose their benefits. So special needs trusts are another option. And this is something that you would set up and you would fund yourself. There's a couple of different options. There's like the Arc of Texas does like a master pool trust where you're like all the money's pooled together. And so there's the investment return on it would be better. The interest. I'm not a finance person, I'll be the first to tell you that. But yeah, special needs trust would be something that you would set up. So a lot of times, like my parents have their special needs trust set up. So they have life insurance, and so when they pass away, like their life insurance will go to that special needs trust to help fund my brother's care. So that can be a good option for people who are going to have, if you're like setting aside like savings accounts, if you're saving up for your individuals, your loved one with a disability, like future needs, a special needs trust can be another option. There's some really great financial planners here in Texas, in the greater Austin, San Antonio, Lubbock area, whose whole job, who's like able accounts and special needs trust and financial planning, like in and out. So if you ever want to be connected with one of them, let me know and I can help connect you guys. Because this is like a very broad overview of able accounts versus special needs trusts. But there's people who are not social workers who understand money a bit better who can help you out with that. Okay. So I've kind of hit on, I'm close to our hour here. I've hit on a lot of the main, I can connect you, Diane. So I've hit on a lot of like the main different aspects of future planning. And if anyone is interested, feel free to email me at this email address and I'll send you the, and actually Diane, if you can go ahead, email me so I have your email, I can get it from Natalie, I guess. But yeah, I have something called a letter of intent. And so the letter of intent goes through everything that I just talked about, and it allows you to write down everything. It's kind of like a will, but not a will. It's a roadmap, and it can kind of really help guide your family as you talk about future planning. I think it's probably one of the single most important documents that we can do as a family when we're talking about future planning. And so that document, that letter of intent, just really allows us to like take maybe what's up here when we're talking about future planning and put it down on paper and make sure that everybody's in agreement on it. My family, we keep our future planning document on a Google, like as a Google Doc, because we'll all spread out. Like I have a brother in Maryland and I live in Austin, my parents are in Lubbock, another sister who's also in Lubbock, but it allows us all to, like, when I have like a couple of minutes, I might like letter of intent and kind of look at it and kind of see what we need to edit, because these letter of intents, they change, people change. But yeah, it just kind of gives our family, I think, like a document that really helps put into words like what we're all thinking and what we're planning, and it puts it all on paper, and it allows us all to kind of talk about it. And it's something, and also it's kept on a Google Drive, so if something would happen, we could easily access it as a family, and we could even give access to someone outside of our family, access to that letter of intent if they needed it. But if anyone has any questions, I guess you guys put them in the group chat. I can attempt to answer them. Awesome. I'm not seeing anything come in, but like I said, feel free to email me. This is my email address. I love to talk about future planning. I feel like personally and professionally passionate about it. So I'm always, I do not know what the CSHCN program is off the top of my head. But there's a lot of acronyms in Texas.
It is Children with Special Healthcare Needs. I just looked it up. It's a HHS program through the state.
I don't know specifically about that, but it would probably fall under that Texas Medicaid like waiver list that would provide funding. And I would go out on a limb and say there's a wait list for it.
It looks like it's for ages 20 or younger unless they have cystic fibrosis, then it can be any age. And there's some income restraints too, constraints.
Yeah. I usually just recommend people, and I can always help like direct people, but definitely like reaching out and like getting, and like it's a lot of red tape, y'all. I'll be the first to admit it, like sit on hold for a long time. But I think, yeah. And I'm always willing to sit on hold with people if you guys need that or help out with. Also, if you check out Texas Sibling Network, I have done a lot of like different Facebook Lives and interviews with people that talk about a lot of these topics. We talk about housing, and I have a really great housing one that I love, as well as one about supported decision making and different guardianship options. You can check out our, just once again, Google. You can Google Texas Sibling Network, but it's, but yeah, we're under the Disability Studies program at UT. But yeah, we have a lot of different resources on our Facebook, on our Instagram, on our website. You can also email me and I can send those directly to you as well. But yeah, I think that's all I got, Natalie.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. This was so good. I'm so glad we finally got to connect. I know we've been back and forth a little bit, but yay.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. This was so good. Thank you everyone for coming, and I will get the recording up and send it out to everyone if you guys wanted to look back at stuff or if you had questions, and I'll send out Colleen's email and I'll send the link to the Texas Sibling Network Facebook page too. So, alrighty. Thank you everyone. Have a good night.